thank you for being here. Good afternoon. All right, I want you all to be relaxed because I want to be relaxed. And if you're nervous and I get nervous, and that's not good. I have the opportunity this afternoon to talk to you about Thurgood Marshall. And I consider it a real honor to be able to do that. I have to tell you that I grew up during the era, well, the latter era of Thurgood Marshall. I knew about him on the Supreme Court. I sort of knew about him as a lawyer at the NAACP, but really never had a chance to learn much about him. And in fact, when he passed away, it was when I was in college, and it didn't even sort of register in our lives. But as I did more research on him and learned more about him, my admiration for him grew. He was a man of principle, a man who believed that change could happen, but it took hard work, and for him it took the law to make change happen. And so when I talk about his life and I talk about what things are important to him, we'll be talking about how he saw the law as an important platform for change in society. But let's go back to his youth and understand who he was and how he became the man that he is. Thurgood Marshall is born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland in 1908. He is the youngest of two sons of his parents. While his family lived there, Baltimore was rated as the most segregated town in the United States. And this was done by the Urban League in 1930. His grandparents and his father and mother's, his grandparents on his father and mother's side were longtime Baltimore residents and activists in Baltimore. And his mother was a teacher in the segregated Baltimore school system. His father held a variety of jobs in the service sector and didn't always hold jobs very long. His father was a person who did not take insults lightly. And he would speak up and push back when people did that, and he lost a number of jobs. But his strong will and his dedication to his honor was something that came through very clearly to Thurgood Marshall as a child. As I said, he was not afraid to tell people what he thought, and Thurgood sort of learned that from him. And this is, I think, a talent that he passed on to his son. And one of the ways he did this was at his dinner table, he would force Thurgood and his brother to have debates with him. And in the debates, the sons had to have very thoughtful and well-developed arguments against him. And he would not go easy on them. He'd make sure that they knew what they were talking about, and he would cut them apart if they weren't doing what he thought was right or saying things that had good basis to it. Thurgood said his father was training him to be a lawyer even then, and he just didn't know it. Marshall's formal training was in the Baltimore colored school system. He was a smart student, but not necessarily a diligent one. He enjoyed a good time. He enjoyed hanging out with his friends. He enjoyed playing sports. He enjoyed all the things outside the classroom, although he was smart and didn't ever do badly, but never did as well as he might have. And often he got in trouble because of his exuberance. And one of the punishments one administrator gave him was to make him go to the basement of the school and to stay until he had memorized the section of the United States Constitution. At the time, Thurgood thought this was a very mean-spirited, cold-hearted thing for the principal to do. But later it became an important set of pieces of knowledge that he had later in his life. So these things that happen when we're younger, tell your children, tell your grandchildren, that these things can really be useful for them in the long run. His bad habits, unfortunately, continued from elementary school into the high school, and he continued to be the life of the party, a person who enjoyed what was going on. He enjoyed sports, and he enjoyed the debate team. When he graduates from high school, he decides to attend Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Have you all heard of that? Okay, yes. It's an HBCU founded in 1854. Many people call it the Black Princeton. Most of his faculty were graduates of Princeton, and the school colors were those of Princeton, which are orange and black. Again, he's a passable student at Princeton, but mostly enjoys fraternity life and the debate team and playing cards. He was a card wizard. In fact, he earned a lot of his money by playing cards in college. So you can see he wasn't a hard-working student at that time. Now, his mother wanted him to be a doctor like his older brother, but Thurgood was not interested. That's not something that he really wanted to do. Plus, he took his first biology course, hated it, and failed it in part because he got in a debate with the teacher that he thought what the teacher had to say was wrong, and that didn't go over very well. So he had to sort of look to other things. And I think social sciences, political science and things like that became more and more of interest to him. Now what changes his actions, what makes him a much more serious student, is that he meets a woman by the name of Vivian Bury. She is a student at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a serious student, and she begins to reshape how Thurgood thinks about school and how he thinks about what's important. They bond together very quickly and become inseparable. In fact, by the time they were seniors, they got married, and they were married during his senior year at Lincoln. He used his knowledge there to actually do fairly well at Lincoln in the end, and he was also very active on the debate team as he had been in high school. When he graduates, the question is, what is he going to do? His mother still wants him to go to medical school. He doesn't want to do that. Instead, what he decides to do is to go to law school. And where he was going to law school was the real issue. Where can I go and get that good law degree? Now, he lived in Baltimore, Maryland, so you would think that going to the law school at the University of Maryland might be an option, but it wasn't, because that school did not admit African-American students. They had not admitted one since 1889, so that was quite a long time ago. So as an alternative, what he decides to do is to live at home and instead to go to another law school about 40 miles away in Washington, D.C., at Howard University. And this transforms his life. Because when he goes there, Howard University's law school gets a new dean, and his name is Charles Hamilton Houston. He is a dynamo, and he is in the process of remaking that law school into something very formidable. Before his arrival, Howard's law school had a pretty bad reputation. It was mostly a night school where people would go there and learn the law after they'd worked all day. And he decided that was not good enough. That was not what he was going to be in charge of. So he decides to transform it from a night school to a full-time day school. And he is very demanding on his students. One of his famous lines, you may have heard this in other places, it's the first thing he says the first day of law school is, look to your left, look to your right. Two of you are not going to be here at the end. And he meant that. He meant that you are going to work hard, you're going to apply yourself, and if you don't, you're out of here, because I don't have time for people who are slackers. He wanted his law students to be leaders in attacking discriminatory laws in this country. He says he wants them to be social engineers. He wants them to change the way this country looks at race, the way this country looked at the issue of poverty and people without money. He wants to retool American society. And Marshall becomes one of his favorite students. And he allows him to sit in on cases that he's having. And one of the things that he does that's very interesting is that because Marshall embraces Houston's vision, he allows him to begin to do some work with him. In fact, Marshall embraces his vision so much that he becomes the top student in his class, and he graduates at the top of Howard's Law School under Houston. And from there, he goes back to Baltimore to take the bar exam and to begin to practice law. Among the most important things he does while practicing for this is he becomes the legal counsel for, as someone said yesterday, one of the most formidable NAACP offices in the country at that time, the one in Baltimore. And what they were doing at that time was trying to create jobs for African Americans in the stores in Baltimore. Stores that would not employ them, stores that sometimes would not allow them to shop there, or would allow them to shop there but would not allow them to be employed there. And he became the legal spokesperson for them. He created a rapport with the police. He made sure that things they did in the boycotts and other steps were legal and did not get them arrested. And that way became the unofficial lawyer for the Baltimore NAACP. During this time, though, he also continues to remain in contact with Houston because he's still his mentor and someone he likes very much. Eventually, after graduating, he does get his law degree, and he decides that he wants to figure out what he wants to do in terms of his next step. So one of the things he did with Houston was they went on a trip through the South to look at African-American segregated schools in the South. He wanted to see what the conditions were like, what people had to put up with in order to go to school and get an education, especially in elementary and in middle schools. And what they observed was that there was a very straightforward effort to make sure that colored schools, African-American schools, did not get good equipment. In fact, one of the things he talked about was they were in, I think in North Carolina, and they saw this white elementary school fully equipped, unused. But they refused to allow the African-American students to use their school, and instead forced them to go to a less equipped school nearby. And this affected them a great deal. And part of what this did was to have them think about what kind of steps can we take to begin to change this situation and make it work better. And it becomes a plan that they have is, how do we begin to get the courts and to change the law so that African-American children can get a quality education and get the kind of equipment they deserve. And the core of their new plan was to leverage the concept of separate but equal. This was a court case decision made in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And in this court case, what the Supreme Court said was that segregation was fine as long as it was separate but equal. So as long as they were set apart but the facilities were the same, there was no problem with it. Now, of course, in reality, that never happened, and the court never stepped forward to make that go away. So the plan that they put into place was, okay, we have this law on the books, so the question is, how can we use it to our own advantage? So what they decided to do is to say, all right, if they have to be separate but equal, let's force these school systems to make black schools separate and equal, and to pay the cost that goes along with this. And the focus initially was on graduate schools and at the college level. They thought, let's start there, there'll probably be less turmoil, and we'll be able to get change to take place there. One of the earliest cases they put into play, check this out, is a law school. And as you can imagine, it was the law school at the University of Maryland. Marshall was angry that he had not been allowed to go to law school there. And what they decided to do is to test the separate but equal clause at the Maryland Law School. They got a graduate of Amherst College to apply. His name was Donald Murray. And he rejected immediately only because of his race. He had the grades, he had the intelligence, he had the writing ability, he had everything, but they said, we do not allow people of color to be here. Marshall immediately takes this to court. And and when they offered to pay Murray's way to go to another law school in another state, Marshall says, no, we can't do that, because if he's going to practice law in Maryland, he has to understand Maryland law. And you can't go to Vermont, you can't go to New York and learn that. You have to be here. So they take it to court. And in this court, they begin to argue that the Maryland school needs to provide separate and equal facilities for Murray at that school. This puts pressure on Maryland because they don't have the funds to create a separate and equal law school. I mean, they thought about the law school at the nearby HBCU, but that wasn't going to work. There wasn't enough funds to do that. So eventually, they took it to the courts, and the state court in Maryland rules that the law school must admit Murray, that you cannot provide separate and equal education any place else. You have to allow him to go to the law school at Maryland. This case raises Marshall's profile in Maryland, but also in the nation. And soon thereafter, Houston asked him to come to New York to join him as a lawyer at the NAACP offices in New York City. And together, they decided to put into place their plan to force the desegregation of colleges and law schools across the country. And the first case that they launched in the state of Missouri. There, they put pressure on them to allow a student by the name of Lloyd Gaines to get admittance into the law school. Again, the issue is the law school doesn't want to do it, but they go to the courts, and the courts say, well, you've got to provide separate and equal facilities for this individual, and there aren't any others like that in the state of Missouri. And the court rules in the favor of the NAACP and in favor of Gaines. And as a result, they're all set and ready to have him start school that following semester. Unfortunately, Gaines disappears. And they're not sure what happens. They think that he was bribed to leave and not go to the law school, which means they had to go back and start from the very beginning to put this into place. So they had to find another case to bring. And they do bring other cases in other states, Oklahoma and Texas in particular, seeking separate but equal facilities. The key was they wanted to make sure that the facilities provided for African Americans in these states, in the law schools and graduate schools, were in fact separate and equal, or you need to let us into your regular school system so that they can get a good education. What the idea was that they thought it would be so expensive that most places couldn't afford to create a separate system, so instead they would just give in and allow these students to go to these schools. And that's what happens. In both instances, the Supreme Court backs them and says they have to be separate and equal, and these schools finally just capitulate and decide that we're going to allow these students to go there. This is a major victory for both Marshall and for the NAACP. And it takes them down the path that eventually gets them to think about challenging other aspects of segregated education. And I think the ripple effect of this is that more African American students are now getting into colleges in the South. And as college students, they are also then demanding all the same amenities as college students should get. They want to go to live in the dorms like everybody else. They want to go to social events. They want to be treated just like any other student, which really changes the entire environment and the entire way these schools are operating. And it puts increasing pressure on these schools to just stop fighting it and just allow these students to come to your school and to be treated like anyone else. This, again, is a great victory for Marshall, for Houston, and for the NAACP. But that's not quite enough for them. They decide we have success in this area. Let's begin to look at other things that we can do to create change legally in the system. Marshall becomes the head of the NAACP in 1938 when Houston leaves the NAACP. He needs to earn more money, and his father, Houston's father, has a law firm in Washington, D.C., so he goes there. But Marshall then becomes the lead lawyer for the NAACP offices starting in the late 1930s. And most of his work then is to focus on civil rights of African Americans in different kind of ways. And there are a number of important cases that take place that we should keep in mind in terms of the kinds of steps he takes. We think about him in terms of the Brown versus the Board of Education, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he does a number of other things, I think, that change how African Americans are treated in various levels of society. For example, they raised a case in Texas about voting rights. In Texas, they have what they call as the Democratic primary, which is more normal everywhere these days. But in Texas, although they didn't prevent African Americans from voting in the major election, they would not allow them to vote in the Democratic primary. And for Texas, this meant that whoever had won the Democratic primary in Texas won the election. And so they were finding a way to prevent African Americans from having an impact on who became elected. The court said this is not right and threw it out. This is a victory for the NAACP. They also did work looking at such things as jury pools, arguing that according to the Constitution, you have to be judged by a jury of your peers. And in many places, African Americans were prevented from getting on the juries. So again, through the courts, they changed how the legal system operates in these places. They also attack housing discrimination. In particular, they're interested in the issue of restrictive covenants, which are sort of agreements between homeowners that they will not sell their properties to anyone who is disagreeable to that community. And very often that was African Americans, it was Jewish people, it was anyone of color who didn't fit into that community. And again, they were able to go to court and overturn these and to get restrictive covenants put to the side. So you can see that he's very active, and his impact is widespread in terms of shifting the landscape, shifting how the courts and shifting how the laws are looking at the issues of African Americans. And probably the other large case that he's very instrumental in is the idea of segregation on school buses. In 1946 and 1940, there's an important case in the Supreme Court called Morgan versus Virginia. And what happens is that a woman by the name of Irene Morgan is traveling home from I think from Delaware into Maryland into Virginia. And as she gets into southern areas, she's forced to change her seats into a segregated setting. And she goes to court. She decides to say that this is not fair. And according to the law, you're not supposed to be able to segregate in interstate travel. And so they take this to court again, and they're able to finally win this in terms of pushing against segregation on buses. I mention this because this is about almost 10 years before what happens in Montgomery with the Montgomery bus boycott. So all these things are taking place under the direction and the guidance of Morgan. Marshall also oversees other cases that sought to prevent the jailing of African Americans unfairly and also being charged unfairly with false crimes. I'm giving you this list because sometimes we think about him in a very narrow kind of way. Also, we don't think about him enough in terms of his life before he becomes a justice on the Supreme Court, and he is having a tremendous impact upon our society, a tremendous impact upon how African Americans are treated under the law and treated in their lives in these places where they live. In fact, he becomes the person that people call for when they're in trouble all over the country. It's sort of the idea that Marshall's on his way, things are going to get better. And he does this. He leads a very aggressive legal campaign in all parts of the country and made him well recognized and a very admired person in the African American community and in the civil rights community. But unfortunately, it made him a person who was hated in many parts of the South. And this, I think, was a problem because his success made him a target. On numerous occasions when he arrived in local places, the local people had to move him from house to house each night. They wanted to make sure that he'd be safe. They also would sometimes put armed guards in front of the house to make sure that he would be safe. He talked often about lying in bed fearful that the KKK might come to that home and try to kill him. And his most frightening moment occurred when he was in Columbia, Tennessee. He had just won a case in Columbia and was leaving by car to go from there to Nashville, Tennessee, to go by train back to New York City. On his way to Nashville, the car he was riding in was stopped twice by the police. They claimed that they were all drinking and they wanted to arrest him for drunken driving. They took him from the car and told the others to go on their way. He was then taken to a lakeside location where there's a mob of individuals waiting for him. The only thing that prevented him from being lynched at that moment was that his friends in the cars refused to drive away. They drove back and disrupted it all. The police decided they didn't want to have witnesses of any type, and they decided to at least take him back to town in front of a judge. And the great story that goes with this is that they took him before the judge in that city, and the judge came down and he said, "What's the issue?" And they said, "They were driving drunk." And he went up to him and he said, "Blow." And he blew, and he said, "This man's not drunk, let him go." And so every once in a while you catch a break in terms of the things that are taking place. But I mention this because I think it speaks to the willingness of Marshall to put himself at risk in order to create change, in order to make things better for his fellow African Americans. And I think it's this willingness and these changes, these small changes that he's created over time, are what lead up to the most important case that he's a part of, and that's the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And this is important because what it represents is a change in policy for the NAACP. Before, they had been looking at how do we make things separate and equal. That had been the policy. Let's figure out how that strategy works. With Brown versus the Board of Education, they change it. They no longer accept the idea that separate but equal is okay, but now they take the position that separate but equal is inherently unequal and not acceptable. And this is sort of revolutionary because it really begins to push the idea of how we should think about education and how we should think about the interaction between people of society. What they say is that when the facilities are unequal and segregated, it harms the self-image and the ability of African American children to learn, and it creates bias against them by their white counterparts. And he says, so by making this decision, even when they are separate and equal, you're still hurting the psyche and the ability to learn of African American children and creating dissonance between them and white children. And one of the things they do in order to show this is the famous Doll test that was put together by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. And if you don't know the Doll test, quickly, an overview is that what they did was to get together with a group of African American children, and they had dolls, one white doll and one black doll. And they would take it to the kids one at a time and ask them their reaction to it and what they'd like to be like. And almost consistently, the black children said they wanted to be like the white doll, not about the black doll. And so what you're seeing is their self-image is being harmed by what's going on in society. And what Marshall and the NAACP is arguing is that this happens particularly in schools, and that we need to find a way to undercut that and allow these children to have a chance to be successful. As you all know, the Supreme Court in 1954 yes, 1954, rules in favor of the NAACP. And the decision sort of creates shock waves across the nation because it's the first time the court has stepped up and said segregation is not acceptable. And this overturns a court case that had been in place for more than half a century. And it really begins to create, I think, turmoil in the nation. And you begin to have different places where there's resistance that emerges as a consequence of this. I live in Virginia, and in Virginia, resistance was huge, and it lasted for many, many years. But probably the instance that got the most news attention was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that's where the governor of Little Rock, Arkansas calls out troops to stop 9 children from getting a chance to get an education in that school system. And after pressure from the NAACP and Marshall, President Eisenhower finally sends federal troops to allow the desegregation process to go forward. As an aside, it's really interesting. Eisenhower didn't want to do that. In fact, Eisenhower was once said that the worst thing I did was to select Earl Warren to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because everything changes and it goes in the direction that supports the kind of things the NAACP is doing. This court case is monumental, as you all know, and it's really an important highlight in Marshall's life. The sad part, though, is that at the same time that he's prosecuting this case and creating this change, his personal life is undergoing some great sadness. His wife of 25 years, Vivian, dies of lung cancer. She was sick throughout the Brown versus the Board of Education trial, but did not tell Marshall about it. So when it's all done, he goes home to find out that she's dying from cancer. And he spends the next several months taking care of her as her health sank. And eventually, she dies, and he has a very hard time coping with the loss of this woman who was so important and such a foundation for all the work that he was doing. What also turns out to be difficult is that there's a new direction beginning to emerge in the civil rights movement. The highlight from the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the highlights of that is that a new individual comes to the forefront as the leader of the civil rights movement. This is Martin Luther King Jr. His belief is a bit different from that of Thurgood Marshall's. King believes that direct action and civil disobedience is the best way to create change. You have to defy bad laws, not try to change them through the courts. And this clearly was not the way that Marshall saw the world. And this goes against his basic beliefs, who believes that you obey the laws, but then you try to overturn them by going to the courts and by allowing the courts to make things better. This puts him at odds with Martin Luther King Jr. and with a lot of the young civil rights people in SNCC and other organizations. And I think what it does is that he begins to see his leadership role as a sort of the leader of the civil rights movement begin to diminish and go by the wayside. And I think it prompts him to think about, what should I be doing next? Should I continue to try to be a leader in the civil rights movement? Or should I think about other aspects of my life that I should take into account? Because clearly, one of the things he was sacrificing as the lawyer and head of the NAACP legal team is he was not making a lot of money. And his family was struggling as part of this. He began to figure out what was the next step I should take. Well, what happens is that about that same time, there is a new president who comes into office by the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And Kennedy is intent upon trying to do more to support things going on in the African American community, in part because he knows his election is in large part, and significant part, due to African Americans leaving the Republican Party and voting Democratic and voting for him because of what he stood for. And one of the steps he takes in his effort to be more sympathetic and more engaged with the African American communities, he nominates Thurgood Marshall to be a federal judge in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And this is an important step forward. He's not the first African American to become a federal judge, but he's the first one to be a circuit court judge for the United States. His nomination process, as you can imagine, is pretty arduous and much of a struggle, because most senators from the South did not want him in that job. And they did a lot of things to delay it and to make it stretch out. In fact, it took more than a year or so before the nomination finally went through. But he is able to get that job, and he serves in that capacity in New York City for about 2 years. This is the first time that that office had ever had an African American as a judge in that office. And it's also a time of legal growth for him, because He'd been very good about civil rights and constitutional law, but now he has to learn about such things as tax law, maritime law, corporate law, and other areas in which he was not expert, but in which he had to be able to offer a point of view. But it's also, as I said, a time of growth for that office because they'd never had an African-American lawyer there before. And he joked that he said when he first walked into that office in 1961, the secretary of the office mistook him for an electrician. They were having trouble with electricity, and they had called in somebody. He walks in the door, and she thought he was an electrician. Well, he thought that was ironic because what he said is that there's no way that a black person could have been in the electricians' union at that time at all. So it's this point, understanding what the society is like, but also understanding that change is slowly coming, not in all areas, but it's coming. As I said, he's in that position for about 2 years. And then in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson appoints him as the marshal of the judge marshal. I'm sorry, he appoints Marshall as U.S. Solicitor General. That's the highest ranking lawyer in the United States. And his job is to look for cases to be taken by the United States, by the government, before the Supreme Court. And Johnson said he did this because he wanted African-American children to, when they visit the Supreme Court, to see an African-American man there arguing cases for the Supreme Court, for the United States government. And he is, as I said, the first African-American Solicitor General. During this time, he's there for 2 years. During this time, he wins 14 of the 19 cases that he argues before the Supreme Court. And over his entire career, Marshall represents and wins more cases before the Supreme Court than any other lawyer of any type in the country. So he's very much experienced and very much used to doing things in front of the Supreme Court. When he took the job initially, Johnson said to him, keep your focus on this job. Don't think about the Supreme Court because that ain't happening. You're going to be the Attorney General and that's going to be your job. As you know, Johnson was devious. And after a couple of years, in 1967, Johnson then nominates Marshall for the Supreme Court. And he's the first African-American, as we all know, nominated for that position. And he became the first African-American to win the appointment for that Supreme Court job. The reason it happens as rapidly as it does is because of Johnson's president. Johnson had been in Congress, and Johnson knew where all the skeletons were hidden. He was able to persuade, cajole, and threaten enough people to make sure that Marshall was elected, because again, most senators from the South did not want this man in particular. They didn't want an African-American on the Supreme Court, but in particular, they did not want this man who had done so much to disrupt the traditions of that part of the country. Johnson has said in the past is that this was one of the most important steps that he took as President of the United States, and probably one of the most detrimental to his career that he ever took, because he argued that along with the Vietnam War and the nomination of Marshall to the Supreme Court, there are two reasons why he decided not to run for a second term, because he felt he didn't have a chance to do that. But this is a great break for Marshall, and it allows him to be a member and to join the club of the Supreme Court. Marshall was sworn into office as the Justice of the Supreme Court in October 2nd, 1967. It's the year I graduated from high school, which is interesting. And it just wasn't registering for us in high school, but it was a really momentous moment for the country. A big crowd came to the court that day to witness the ceremony, and this included President Johnson himself, members of Congress, his family, and others who wanted to witness this historic occasion. And it was an important moment for Marshall himself, something he had never dreamed would be possible, and something he took very seriously and was really excited to be a part of. He then goes on to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States for the next 24 years. So he has a long career there. And it begins as a very positive experience for him, because he joins the very liberal court of Earl Warren, the one that Eisenhower said he shouldn't have put on the court. He, like Warren, believed in an activist court. They believe in a court that saw the Constitution as a living document, not one that should be interpreted just as it was done back in the days after the American Revolution, but as a living document through whose words you could figure out how it would apply to the world in which they were a part. As a course of this, they passed many decisions which sought to protect both poor people, minorities, and the rights of women, because they felt this is part of what the founding fathers probably would have wanted had they been part of the world at this time. It was under Warren that the Supreme Court ruled unanimously on the Brown case. So this is a place and a time that is very good for Marshall to become a part of that court. And Marshall is very happy with the rulings of the members of that Supreme Court as he joins it. And he and Warren become very good friends. Typical of the cases that Marshall was asked to write the decision for were cases like Barber versus Page, in which the court ruled that the defendant had to have the opportunity to be confronted by his accusers. That in some southern locations, what they would do is they would have a person in jail who would testify against this person, Barber, and they would convict him based upon that testimony, but his lawyer had no chance to cross-examine him. And so the court says, you've got to allow him to come in to the court and to testify at least to be quizzed by the other attorney to see what might be wrong in his testimony and what may not be truthful. As I said, these early years for Marshall on the Supreme Court were wonderful. He was enjoying himself. They were making decisions and rulings that he found very much himself in tune with and believed that the courts were doing the right kind of things. The problem is, as I said, he was there for 24 years, and as we all know, over 24 years, things change. New presidents come into office. New presidents nominate and have elected new members of the Supreme Court. And what Marshall sees happening is that it begins to shift from the much more open to ideas court of Earl Warren to now a court ruled by people like Warren Burger. And these more conservative justices do not agree with a lot of the decisions that were made during the Warren court. And Marshall found himself more isolated and not as respected, he would say, by those members of the court as he had been previously. These new members of the court believed in a very static interpretation of the Constitution. They believed that you should interpret strictly strict construction, and as a consequence, you should not deviate from the very words on the Constitution. You should not think about them in any other way except the ways they're written along the way. So as a result, they did not believe it was up to the justices to reinterpret aspects of the Constitution. And Marshall, as a consequence, found himself often offering dissenting opinions to the things they put forward. He believed that the court was undermining much of the work he had done as a lawyer, as part of the NAACP. He saw his career's work being destroyed. He felt that these new justices were much more concerned with giving the police more power, limiting desegregation efforts, and limiting the rights of the poor. These are the things he'd always believed were essential to what the country should stand for. And he felt that they had no understanding of the impact of their decisions on the lower strata of society, that they lived up here, they were making rulings that were impacting people below them, and out of their life experience, they had no sense of what that meant. And one of the things that he argued is that that was my life. I know what their lives are like, and here's what's happening when you make these decisions. So it's not just something off in the distance that is idealistic, it's real and pragmatic, and you need to understand what that means. A case that particularly angered him was the court case that took place in Richmond, Virginia, in the state where I live. The issue was that the city of Richmond, imposed rules on companies that took contracts with them, is that if you got a contract with the city of Richmond, you had to make sure that you also subcontracted to minority companies, women and African Americans and other minority companies as part of the contract. Well, this one company, Croson, got a contract and decided not to hire any minority contractors. And the city took away their contract. Well, they went to court, and under this new court, the court decided that the city of Richmond was wrong, and that a decision made by a previous court under Warren, who had said this was okay, they ruled as unconstitutional. And they argued that that was a flawed decision, and that it excluded people that should not be excluded. And as a consequence, they felt that this idea of compensatory help was not something that should be done, and that, in fact, the fact that the city had been doing this years in the past should not be applied to the present. This, as you can imagine, made Marshall very angry. He found it hard to believe that in such an obvious history of discrimination that had been the history of Richmond, the city of Richmond, that the court could overlook that and decide that, well, we don't have to worry about this anymore. That's the past, and we're in the present. And he saw it as a retreat from the standards that had been set by the Warren Court years earlier. And in his dissent, what he said is that this decision represents a full-scale retreat from the long-standing support by the court for race-conscious remedial efforts. To this view, he says, I must dissent. This and other conservative decisions left Marshall angry and bitter as a member of that court. And he often spoke out in public against the direction in which they were heading and the kind of things that they were doing. And probably the most noteworthy time he does this is a speech that he gives in Hawaii in 1987. And it's during the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, sort of like what we're getting ready to do now. He argues in his speech that the Constitution is in fact a flawed document. And it is a document that excluded more people than it included, including women and African Americans and people who are enslaved, and Native Americans as well. And it took too much struggle and the addition of amendments to the Constitution to make it more equal, to make it think about the issues of these individuals. So for him, he felt that this celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution should not be one that was a celebration of what it was, but should be a celebration of what it had become and how it was evolving. You can imagine this didn't go over very well with his friends on the Supreme Court, who saw the original Constitution as a very sacred document that should not be changed. And this is exactly what Marshall hoped would happen. He wanted to make people angry. He wanted them to not feel complacent in what they're doing and what was taking place. The problem is that while he was stirring the pot, he was getting older, and he was beginning to suffer from a variety of different health issues. He had a weak heart, he had declining vision, and failing hearing. And some also argued he was suffering from memory loss along the way. Finally, his ill health took its toll, and he decides to retire from the court in 1991. With his reaction to his predecessor, he never said much publicly, but privately we know is that he was not very happy about the nomination of Clarence Thomas. He felt Clarence Thomas was the opposite and opposed everything that he stood for. And it was a slap in the face to have that happen. And he thought, although he thought it was a continuation of the trend he'd been seeing for the last several years, this shift to a more conservative point of view that did not want to see equality happening in the society. 2 years after his resignation, on January 24th, 1993, Thurgood Marshall dies at the age of 85. His coffin is placed in the Great Hall of the Supreme Court, and 18,000 people line up to have the opportunity to pay their last respects. After a ceremony at the National Cathedral, he was buried at Arlington's National Cemetery. Thurgood Marshall, I believe, left behind an impressive legal legacy of defending human rights. He believed that everyone deserved proper representation and equal treatment. This earned him the title of Mr. Civil Rights because many knew his record, and their record made him a person who cared about the civil rights of all people in the society. While he accomplished his accomplishments of becoming the first African-American Solicitor General and the first African-American Supreme Court Justice are very noteworthy and important. As I've said earlier, I think those are important and should not be downplayed and should be seen as significant steps. I personally am much more impressed by his work as a lawyer for the NAACP because he was sort of working in the vineyards, as they said, when it was very hard work. When he was in a society where segregation was the norm, where discrimination was the norm, where educational separation was the way of doing things, where the law system worked in ways consistently that did not watch out for the rights of the poor and people of color. And it was a dangerous thing to decide to do, as I talked about some of those instances. So he's doing this at the turmoil of his own life for something he believes is very important and something he believes that had to be done in order to make the country change. He had to break the ground and to make the country better around social justice, as he had been asked to do by his mentor, Houston. He believed the idea of separate but equal which condoned segregation had to disappear, and that's what his life work was all about. His efforts, I think, made America a better place for all Americans, particularly for minorities and for the poor. And I think he's a banner for us to all look to as we look at society and how it's evolving, and what kind of things he might have thought about, what kind of things he might have done, what kind of things we can do to uphold his efforts and what he stood for. He's an important man, a significant man, and someone I grew to admire the more I learned about him. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. How do you compare Marshall to Clarence Thomas, number one? A secondary question, what is Clarence Thomas' effect on the African American community, I imagine, today?
Okay. Well, comparing them, I think, is like comparing opposites. That everything that Thurgood Marshall stands for, Clarence Thomas does not. Clarence Thomas, I think, doesn't believe in he believes in integration, but he doesn't believe in affirmative action. He doesn't believe in anything that works to give support to people who need support in order to be on the same level. Thomas, I believe, is a person who believes very much in the idea of you make your success on your own by pulling up your own bootstraps. That society owes you nothing, and that if you just work hard enough, you'll be able to be successful. Marshall was just the opposite. He believed that society put impediments in the way of people's ability to be successful, to navigate this society, and that it was part of the task of society to provide support and help to allow them to get there. I mean, one of the things he often said about the idea of segregation in schools, he said it's the only way you're going to get equal facilities and equipment and things for black children is to set them next to a white child. And now you can't separate that out. You can't sort of give one to the other because they're right together, and you got to give everybody the same thing. And I think that's how he saw the world, is that if you get people together, the chances for opportunity get stronger. If you keep them apart, it allows you to sort of discriminate in how you do things. What was the other part?
And the second half was, what is Clarence Thomas' effect on the African American community?
He's an impediment. He's a roadblock. He doesn't believe that people should get special treatment and that you should just figure it out on your own and get there on your own on the way. I think he sort of felt like he got affirmative action and it shouldn't have happened. And so it shouldn't happen to other kinds of people. So his impact is that he is not taking into account all the issues that face people who aren't in the mainstream of American society and the kind of issues they face in terms of employment, education, social status, just a variety of things that can really hurt the way that people are able to be successful.
In your research about Marshall, what most surprised you?
What? Most what?
In the research that you've done about Marshall, what most surprised you?
Oh, gosh. That's a good question. I don't know if I can pick out one thing. There are things he did that I didn't know about that I found interesting. I mentioned to people yesterday that not only did he do things in Baltimore, but he was very instrumental in school issues in and around the state of Maryland, and trying to help teachers keep their jobs and students to get access to good facilities. So I guess maybe that might be the most interesting thing that I learned about him. Well, I know the other thing is that when he decided to go to work with the NAAAHC in New York, he did that after he'd been offered a full scholarship to the law school at Harvard, and decided he wanted to go work with Houston rather than to get a full scholarship. And this full scholarship meant he would be making a whole lot more money than he was going to make going to New York to work for the NAAAHC. But it gives you a sense of his dedication and belief in what needed to be done and the personal sacrifices that had to be made to accomplish it.
Did Mr. Marshall try to influence legislation? Did he interact with the Black Caucus?
I'm not sure he directly interacted a great deal with the Black Caucus. Again, he was sort of at odds at that point. He was sort of found himself on the outside. And what was the other part of the question?
And did he try to influence legislation?
Well, I think he tried to influence legislation through the courts, by getting the courts to pass rulings that then allow people in the legislatures to act in a certain kind of way. And to sometimes force them to act that kind of way, because if the court rules something has to change, then that forces the people in the legislatures to then create new laws.
Would it, Marshall be in favor of expanding the court as a current remedy to persistent, I'm not sure what that is, inequality, I think it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. My gut reaction to that is no, that he's very traditional in that sense, and he would not want to change it. He'd like to change who's on it, but I'm not sure he'd want to change the numbers.
As courts seem to be giving up their constitutional duty to be a check on the executive branch, does Marshall have advice on how to combat this situation?
To combat what's going on on the executive?
With a lack of check on executive branch. I guess what would his,
I know.
how would he combat that? What would his, he come up with?
Well, what I think about is that was happening when he was around. You had Richard Nixon, you had Ronald Reagan, you had courts that were supporting them. And I don't think there's an easy way to it. I just believe that he was very much of the mindset that you work through the laws and you work through the courts and you try to get cases before the court and keep pushing and pushing that way. Because I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
Would or was Marshall's response to the critical of critical race theory on Marshall's confidence in the law to bring about change?
Well, I think I would say he believed in the critical race theory, maybe not in those terms, but he believed that in fact that race played an important part in determining people's ability to be successful in the society, to get access to the resources they need, to be treated in a fair kind of way. And I think critical race theory connects with that.
Okay. I might have to see if the person that wrote this, I'm not sure what the letters here, but it says, "This is not about Marshall." Okay. Sir, what is the future of the NMAAH? Did I get that right, whoever wrote that? I'm so worried.
Oh, okay, that's the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Okay. Right. I think the future is positive, and I think it is strong. There are very good people there. I think they have a very strong board of African American entrepreneurs and others. They have a secretary who was the director there for a while, and I think he's going to do all he can to prevent it. There are no guarantees in life, but I think it's going to be hard for there to be an attack on one individual museum at the Smithsonian, because I think part of what we forget is that not only are they making commentary about the African American Museum, but they're also talking about the Indian Museum. They're talking about the Women's Museum. They're talking about the Latino Museum. So there are a whole bunch of museums there, and the portrait gallery, where there are things that they don't like. But I think it's going to be very hard to really attack the Smithsonian as a whole. But this is a different world, a crazy world, so can't predict the future entirely.
Last question, it'll be my question. What would Marshall, I know what I believe that he would do based on the conversation we had at the reception, but do you think that he would see a pathway through what we're going through now, and does change meet itself and circle back around, and who Thurgood Marshall was? Will we see again someone else rise and straighten out our Supreme Courts and the laws at this point?
Well, I think what we have to keep in mind is think about the era in which Thurgood Marshall was operating. It's sort of like this era. And I think his solution then was, for him, it's you go to the courts and you continue to fight and you continue to put yourself at risk and you continue to do the things that you think are right. And that's going to be a long haul. I mean, he starts working as a lawyer in the NAACP in the 30s. And it's into the 50s and 60s before he even begins to see a simmer of hope, a bit of hope along the way. And I guess he would say, persevere, believe in the future, and that change comes slowly, but it can come if you continue to work for it.
Thank you.